As the years go on, the veil between our world and the next continues to thin. In this compilation episode, we're going to go over 12 shocking mysteries military can't explain, from strange things washed up on the beach to some of the most bizarre and terrifying accounts you've probably ever heard. You won't want to miss this one. On the morning of September 12, 2003, a marine biologist named Dr. Claire Chen stood at the bow of a research vessel about 40 miles off the coast of Western Australia. She was holding a specialized tracking beacon, and she was watching as her team was trying to wrangle this massive 3-meter female great white shark that they had caught. The shark was thrashing around in the water, and the team was doing their best to keep it steady so she could attach the beacon. The beacon was actually a pretty big deal for their team. It cost about 25 grand, and it could track all sorts of data. The shark's location, its depth, the water temperature around it, pretty much everything. Dr. Chen and her team had been trying for weeks to get a beacon on a great white this size. They'd actually gone through 3 different sharks that were too small before finding this one. After about 25 minutes of struggling with the shark, they managed to secure the beacon to its dorsal fin. The team then released the shark, and they all watched as it disappeared into the water. Dr. Chen was relieved that everything had gone perfect. The beacon was now transmitting data exactly like it was supposed to. And for the next 4 months, everything was great. The shark was doing typical shark things, swimming around its territory, diving for food, normal migration patterns, and Dr. Chen would come into her office every morning at the Marine Institute, pour her coffee, and check the data from the previous day. In fact, it had become such a routine that she barely paid attention to it anymore. But on January 23rd, 2004, she was sitting at her desk looking at the previous day's data when she noticed something strange. The water temperature reading from the beacon had suddenly jumped from 7 degrees Celsius to 25 degrees, and before she could even process what that meant, she saw that the depth reading showed the shark had somehow plunged to over 500 meters in a matter of seconds. Frantically, she called over her research partner, a Dr. Marcus Thompson, and showed him the readings. They thought initially that it was just the beacon malfunctioning, but the signal completely stopped. 2 weeks later, a beach maintenance worker was doing his morning cleanup on a beach about 2.5 miles from where Dr. Chen's team had originally tagged the shark. He found what looked like a piece of scientific equipment partially buried in the sand. It was their beacon. Shortly after this, the team were reunited with the beacon again. But everything about the situation was not normal. The beacon looked like it had been bleached white, and there wasn't a single trace of algae growth on it, which made no sense for something that had supposedly been in the ocean for 4 months. The team could not explain how this came to be, but they were determined to find out. That night, Dr. Chen stayed late at her office going over and over the data. A great white shark doesn't just vanish, and they don't dive 500 meters in seconds. That's physically impossible for them. And she was actually about to pack up and head home when her phone rang. It was Dr. Thompson calling to tell her that the lab results had come back from the beacon analysis. The white discoloration they'd found wasn't bleaching. It was evidence that the beacon had been exposed to stomach acid, really strong stomach acid, the kind you'd find in the digestive system of a large marine predator. Dr. Chen and her team would write up their findings, but they had no real explanation for what happened to their shark. The report just kind of got filed away and forgotten about. That is, until 2013, when something happened off the coast of British Columbia that would make Dr. Chen dig out that old report. On the morning of July 15th, 2013, 2 commercial fishermen named Mike Reeves and Tom Paulson were on their trawler about 50 miles north of Vancouver. They were pulling in their morning catch when Tom happened to look over the starboard side and froze. He called Mike over and pointed out into the water about 100 yards from their boat was a sperm whale, which was unusual enough to see in these waters. But both men noticed something else was happening to this whale. Something massive was attacking it. The fishermen could see this huge dark shape moving around the whale. They saw this tail fin that kept breaking the surface. And shockingly, according to Tom, the width of this tail fin was about the same as their fishing trawler. The The two men watched this attack for 15 minutes until the water just went still. Immediately, they radioed the Coast Guard to report what they'd seen. But before any vessels could arrive, they got another call about a whale carcass that had washed up on a nearby beach. When marine biologists arrived, they were met with the partial body of a sperm whale. The lower third of this whale had been removed, not torn off or ripped away, but cut off in one clean bite. And embedded in the spine was a tooth, a single tooth that was 7.5 inches long. For comparison, the largest great white shark tooth ever found was about 3 inches. Whatever had attacked this whale was capable of taking bites that were 2 to 2.5 meters wide. When scientists did calculations based on the bite radius and tooth size, they estimated this predator had to be around 30 meters long, or roughly 90 plus feet. After this, many marine biologists from all over the world really started to pay attention. But for the next 6 years, besides some questionable photos and unconfirmed sightings, there wasn't any concrete evidence of a massive marine predator. But that changed in March of 2019. A group of Australian fishermen radioed the Coast Guard about a dead great white shark they'd found floating about 20 miles offshore. When marine officials arrived, they found a 12-foot great white shark that had been bitten almost completely in two. The bite marks wrapped around the entire middle section of the shark. One of the officers on scene said later that looking at those bite marks was like looking at a great white shark bite on a seal, except this was on a great white. Now, sharks do attack other sharks, and this is a common thing, but the big deal here is just how large of a bite was taken out. Well, as it turns out, there was this well-known great white shark that researchers called Seafish, and she was about 4.5 meters long, and scientists had been tracking her movements for years. In June of 2019, a research vessel spotted Seafish near the surface and noticed something very strange. She had this massive healed scar that ran from her pectoral fin all the way to her dorsal fin. Dr. Gregory Martinez, who was the lead researcher studying Seafish, took detailed photographs and measurements of the scar tissue. After analyzing the bite pattern and comparing it to known predator bite marks, he determined that whatever had attacked Seafish had to be at least 9 meters long. Another similar incident to all of this is the case of the beast from Briar Island off southeastern Canada, where, based on partial remains, scientists had estimated a predator of about 26 feet. They found reports of a creature that had bitten a whale shark, where the bite radius suggested something around 40 feet long. However, the largest confirmed great white shark ever recorded was a specimen nicknamed Dark Blue that measured just over 6 meters. But all of these incidents were pointing to something much bigger, something that was hunting great white sharks like great whites hunt seals. Dr. Martinez began reaching out to other marine research stations around the world looking for any unusual data they might have. Interestingly, he came across Dr. Chen's old report from 2003 about the tracking beacon, and he was so blown away by what the report showed that he actually flew down to Australia to meet with her and look at the data. The two scientists spent 3 days going over everything. They looked at the depth readings, the temperature spike, the condition of the beacon when it was found, and Dr. Chen pulled out all these old photographs she had stored in a filing cabinet. Pictures of the beacon before they attached it and after they found it. The difference was striking. They happened to capture this series of underwater recordings from a hydrophone array near where Dr. Chen's shark had vanished. On the morning the beacon stopped transmitting, the hydrophones had picked up this incredibly low frequency. It was way below what any known marine mammal produces, and it lasted 45 seconds and stopped. While all this investigation was happening, the fishing communities along the Pacific coast were dealing with strange situations. Boats that had been fishing the same spot for generations suddenly couldn't find any fish. You had commercial fishing vessels reporting that their sonar was picking up these massive shapes moving through the water, but they were too big to be whales. In fact, a fisherman named Jack Torres, who'd been working on the boats for 30 years, explained that one morning he was out checking his crab pots when his boat's depth finder showed something huge moving underneath him. It was longer than his 85-foot boat. He panicked and radioed other boats in the area to ask if they were seeing anything strange on their instruments. 3 other captains reported the same thing. Fast forward again to December of 2019, and the International Marine Biology Conference was being held in Sydney, Australia. Dr. Chen and Dr. Martinez presented all their findings to a room full of reputable marine biologists and oceanographers. They had laid out all the evidence, the tracking data, the sperm whale attack, the bite marks on the great white, everything. And after finishing their presentation, Dr. James Wilson, who was one of the most respected marine biologists in the world, stood up and told the room something he'd never shared publicly. Back in 1998, he'd been doing deep sea research off the coast of South Africa. His team had sent down an unmanned submersible to roughly 900 meters, and the sub had very powerful lights and multiple cameras because they were studying deep sea life. Dr. Wilson explained that on one of the camera feeds, they saw something move past the submersible, and it was so big that it blocked out all their lights for several seconds as it passed. Even though they only caught a glimpse of it, what they saw didn't match any known species. And judging by the data, it was roughly 25 meters long at minimum. At the time, he didn't want to report what they had seen because he was worried about his reputation and worried about people would think he was just chasing sea monsters or trying to cash in on something. But now, with everything else going on, he felt like it was time to speak up. The ocean covers a massive amount of our planet, and we've only explored about 5% of it. And in all that unexplored darkness, something massive is swimming around. Something big enough to hunt great white sharks. Something that can dive deeper than whales. Something that, despite all of our modern technology, we still haven't been able to fully document or explain. Let's transition to something a little drier, shall we? In this next segment, we're going to explore a strange phenomenon that's been happening for decades now. And disturbingly, it's happening to rural areas all over the world. I don't want to spoil it, just watch it. On the morning of September 14th, 2023, Sergeant Mitch Madden of the Crook County Sheriff's Department pulled his patrol car onto a dusty access road leading to the Thompson Cattle Ranch in eastern Oregon. As he drove down the gravel path, he could see 3 other police vehicles already parked near a cluster of officers standing in the field. The rancher, Bill Thompson, was pointing towards something in the distance. Sergeant Madden quickly parked his car and walked over to the group. Even though it was September and it was starting to cool down, the officers there were already sweating. As Madden got closer, he could see why. About 50 feet away lay a 1,200-pound black Angus cow. The animal was on its side, and even from this distance, Madden could tell this wasn't a normal livestock death. The rancher told the officers he had found the cow early that morning during his routine check. At first, he thought maybe it had been attacked by coyotes or mountain lions, but when he investigated, he knew that it was different. The cow's eyes, reproductive organs, and part of its jaw had been removed with surgical precision. There was no blood anywhere around, no signs of a struggle, or any tracks leading to or from the body. Officers who examined the scene were equally disturbed and confused. One of the deputies pointed how clean the cuts were, like they'd been done with a laser. Others noted how the grass wasn't even bent or disturbed. It appeared as if the animal had been dropped from a great height. This was the 6th cattle mutilation in Crook County in the past year alone, and each case followed the same pattern. Back at his patrol car, Sergeant Madden called Keith Carson, who is a local veterinarian who had examined 3 of the previous mutilated cattle. Keith explained that in his 30 years of veterinary practice, he'd never seen anything like these cases. The cuts were just too precise to be from predators, in addition to all the other strange things. And Keith had worked with the FBI on similar cases in the 70s. He had examined mutilated cattle in Nebraska, where farmers had reported strange lights in the sky on the night their animals were killed. The cuts back then were identical to what he was seeing now in every way, and he knew that they were somehow connected. Well, a week after finding the mutilated cow, Bill Thompson sat in Sergeant Madden's office describing how the incident had affected his ranch, and his other cattle wouldn't go near that part of the pasture anymore. Even his dogs refused to approach the area, and he had lost 3 more cows in the past month. They had simply vanished, and so he was now doing armed patrols of his property at night, but it didn't make him feel any safer. Things were worse inside the home. He was robbed of his peace, his children were having nightmares almost nightly, and his wife was at her breaking point and wanted to sell the ranch and move to the city. Disturbingly, other ranchers in the area were experiencing the same problems. Jim Baker, who owned the neighboring ranch, told officers his cattle had been acting strange for weeks before he found one of them dead. The animals would bunch together at night, facing outward in a defensive circle. They would become agitated for no apparent reason. Even his most docile cows had become aggressive and skittish. It was all very strange. Now at this point, the Crook County Sheriff's Department was simply overwhelmed, because not only were they not equipped to handle this in terms of training and budget, but they weren't even sure where to start. They had increased patrols in rural areas, but with hundreds of square miles to cover and limited resources, they knew they couldn't protect every ranch. So they had reached out to the FBI for help, but the federal response was very limited. Shocker there, right? However, there were similar cases happening in other states, and no one seemed to have any answers. Local veterinarians and other animal experts from Oregon State University had examined tissue samples from 2 of the mutilated cattle. Here's the twist. It appeared that the cuts had been made with a tool that simultaneously cut and cauterized the wound. Technology that should not exist outside of advanced medical facilities. Additionally, unusual chemical compounds were found in the tissue. The only clear pattern was that each mutilation occurred during the new moon when nights were darkest. Now, in response to this, ranchers had begun installing infrared cameras and motion sensors on their properties. Some had even hired private security, while others had simply sold their herds and left the business altogether. Not only were there no answers ever found, but cases just like this one continue up to this very day. And folks, it gets worse. Similar mutilations have been reported in Argentina, England, and Australia. Whatever was happening in Crook County that year was part of a pattern that stretched back decades and spanned continents. After all these years of investigation, we still don't know who or what is responsible. This next segment jumps into one of the most bizarre mysteries the military can't explain. And that, folks, is the Alaskan Triangle, a place known for its remoteness, but also magnetic anomalies and all the strange things that go on there. In fact, there was a very notable case that occurred here years ago. Check it out. On the morning of October 16th, 1972, House Majority Leader Hale Boggs walked into a small airport in Anchorage, Alaska, carrying his briefcase and adjusting his tie against the cold. He was there with Representative Nick Begich and Begich's aide, Russell Brown, for what was supposed to be a normal campaign flight to Juneau. Don Johns, their pilot, was already there doing his pre-flight checks on his Cessna 310, and he's going through his checklist. Everything seemed normal. The weather report showed some clouds, but nothing too concerning. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that would make anybody think twice about taking off that day. And the airport staff even kindly waved to the 4 men who boarded the plane and saw that Hale and Nick were actually laughing about something as they climbed aboard. Russell was carrying this stack of campaign materials they were going to use at their next stop. And Don, he was just doing what he always did, being thorough, professional, following every protocol. And at 9:13 a.m., Don radioed the tower for permission to take off. He got clearance, and the plane began taxiing down the runway. The tower operator watched as the Cessna lifted smoothly into the air and banked toward the southeast, heading for Juneau. The last thing he remembered seeing was the sun glinting off the plane's wings as it vanished into the clouds. Now, the flight was only supposed to take about 3 hours. Don had radioed in their position a couple times during the first hour, just totally routine stuff. But An hour later, at about 10:18, he made one final transmission, reporting they were flying at 7,000 feet near Johnstone Point. Everything sounded normal, and the four men were basically halfway to their destination. And then, nothing. That was the last anyone would ever hear from them. When the plane didn't arrive in Juneau at its scheduled time, nobody really panicked at first because in Alaska, especially back then, flight delays were common. I mean, sometimes pilots would have to change course because of weather, or they'd have to land somewhere else to wait out a storm. And so for a couple of hours, everyone just figured they'd show up eventually. But hours and hours rolled around, and by evening, there was still no sign of the plane and no radio contact. And so people began to get worried. This was a pretty big deal. I mean, we're talking about the House Majority Leader of the United States and a sitting congressman who had vanished. Immediately, the Coast Guard launched what would become one of the largest search ops in American history, and within 24 hours, they had over 40 aircraft up in the air searching and scanning an area of roughly the size of West Virginia. Military actually sent in an SR-71 Blackbird spy plane to take these incredibly detailed photographs, which they had never used one of these planes for a search op before. But what made this really strange though was that the weather was perfect for searching. And usually when planes go down, especially in Alaska, bad weather is what makes it hard to find them. But during this, they had clear skies, visibility was great. These were ideal conditions. And they knew the exact route and where they should be looking because they had Don's last radio transmission giving them his location. But day after day after day, they just turned up with nothing. There was no wreckage, there was no oil slick, there was no emergency beacon signal, there wasn't even a piece of debris. This plane had literally, with 4 people on board, mind you, just completely vanished. And as this was going on, search teams began noticing some really weird things, like their compasses would suddenly start spinning for no reason, or that their radios would pick up these really odd static noises that nobody could decipher or explain. And multiple pilots reported this really unsettling feeling of disorientation, like they couldn't trust their own instruments anymore. In fact, one search pilot, a guy named Jack Anderson, had been flying in Alaska for over 20 years, and he told his supervisor something about the search felt wrong. And he said when they'd fly over certain areas, they'd get these intense feelings of dread, like something was telling them to stay away. Their equipment would malfunction and then they'd leave. And as soon as they did that, everything would go back to normal. There was a radio operator named Bill Stevens who was working at the Anchorage Control Tower that morning. And Bill, having worked there for 15 years, was actually the last person to ever have contact with Don's plane. And he would go on to tell investigators something that was incredibly strange, and it makes all of us wonder if there was truly something else going on. And so Bill said that during that last transmission at 10:18 a.m., everything appeared normal. Like I told you guys, Don was just giving his position update, which was very routine. But then right at the end of the transmission, Don's voice suddenly changed. And Bill said Don started speaking really slowly, like he was confused about something. And then Don started saying stuff that didn't make any sense. And he said, "The sky looks different up here." Now, Bill didn't think much of it at the time, but about 30 seconds after that transmission ended, all of Bill's equipment in the tower just went haywire, and his radar screen started showing these weird patterns he'd never seen. The radio started picking up this almost ominous low humming sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere out in the direction where Don's plane had been. And then everything went dead. So Bill immediately called over his supervisor, and it took them 10 minutes of just trying to get the equipment working again, and it finally became functional. And when they did get it back online, they realized Don's plane was just gone. It wasn't even showing up on any radar anywhere. But folks, if you don't know the story, it gets hairier. Because when they went back later and checked the radar data from right before everything went dead, there was something that nobody could really explain. The data showed that Don's plane hadn't descended or crashed. It hadn't turned or changed course. It had just vanished. 1 second it was there at 7,000 feet, and the next second it wasn't. And Bill wasn't the only one who experienced something odd that day, because there was actually a weather station about 50 miles from where Dawn's last transmission came from. And the two guys working there that morning, they said that right around 10:20 a.m., all their instruments suddenly spiked. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in less than a minute, which, mind you, is extreme, and their compass needles started spinning like crazy. And they both described hearing that same ominous, weird low frequency sound that made them feel physically sick. These two guys had worked at that station for years and they'd never had anything like this happen. Later, after they checked their instruments thoroughly, there was no record of any of these readings. It was like it had never even happened. So at this point, we're roughly about a week into the search, and they brought in this local guy named Thomas George. Now, Thomas was actually a Tlingit elder who had lived in the region his whole life. And he was very familiar with the region, the mountains, the terrain, everything. So, he was probably one of the best guys to bring on the team. And after explaining to Thomas exactly where they were looking, he kind of just smirked and, shook his head at them and told them that's where the Kushtaka lives. And he went on to explain that the Kushtaka was this shape-shifting spirit his people have known about for generations, and it's very dangerous. And there is a very specific area, which was right where Dawn's last transmission had come from, that the Tlingit people had always avoided. In fact, his grandfather used to tell him that planes and boats that went into that area would sometimes vanish and never be found again. But of course, the search op wasn't going to entertain what they considered supernatural nonsense. And so they began to get really frustrated with him. But he explained that back in 1952, he had been helping search for another plane that had vanished in almost the exact spot. And during the search, they found this clearing way up in the mountains that nobody could explain, like something massive had just pushed down all the trees in a perfect circle. Of course, there was no crash debris, there's no burn marks, nothing to really explain why it was there. And so Thomas agreed to take a group of searchers up to this clearing, and when they got there, all their equipment started acting up, just like what was happening to the search planes. And of course, nothing worked, right? No compasses, radios, it was just dead. But even when they tried to take pictures of this clearing, every camera just malfunctioned. But the few photos that did come out just showed this weird black mist that nobody had seen when they were actually there. One of the searchers, a man by the name of Mike Peterson, explained how it felt like they were being watched the entire time they were in that clearing, that something was apparently just waiting for them to leave. Now, to Thomas, again, he explained that this was totally normal, and there's a reason his people had these stories and warnings of these things, because, again, many of his tribe's people had encountered and dealt with this thing for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, they had a name for it, and they called it the place where the sky touches the ground. And apparently, sometimes when conditions were just right, people would see things up there that shouldn't exist. Fast forward all the way almost 50 years. To 2019, and an investigator of the name of Sarah Martinez really started taking this case seriously, and she started looking into all these disappearances and what people had started calling Alaska's Bermuda Triangle. And she found some really strange things, because it wasn't just Dawn's plane that had vanished. Right? This isn't an isolated incident. And as a matter of fact, since 1988, there had been over 16,000 people who've just vanished in this exact area. And after Sarah had gotten access to all these old search and rescue records, she started to see this really bizarre pattern. In 2007 alone, the area had nearly 3,000 people go missing, which is roughly about 4 people per every 1,000 residents just vanishing, and so that's wild. Now, interestingly, there was also a report from 1992 that had never been made public. The Air Force had actually done this classified study of the area long after Dawn's plane disappeared. They had sent up these special aircraft with all kinds of sophisticated monitoring equipment, and what they found was that this whole region had these massive electromagnetic anomalies that nobody could explain. Readings showed that in certain spots, the magnetic field would suddenly spike so high it would max out their instruments. And the spikes always happen in the same places, including exactly where Dawn's last radio transmission had come from. It was also discovered that compasses in these areas would consistently point 30 degrees off from where they should, which, again, if you guys know anything about how compasses work, is pretty significant and enough to get you lost. disturbingly, every single person who had vanished in this area had last been seen in or near one of these magnetic anomaly zones. And just like with Dawn's plane, none of these people have ever been found. And not just they're gone, it's just like there's no bodies, no belongings, there's no evidence of them. Now, in late 2022, a group of researchers were using this brand new type of radar technology that scanned the area where Dawn's plane had vanished. And even though they weren't looking for anything related to this at all, because they were actually just doing a geological survey trying to map underground formations, they found deep underground caverns or spaces in the exact spots where all these magnetic anomalies had been recorded. It's pretty freaky if you ask me. I mean, these were just massive cavities in the earth. And I'm not talking like normal caves, like normal formations. They were like intentionally dug out, like perfectly spherical. And we all know that nature doesn't just create perfectly round caves. When they analyzed the radar data closely, these spherical cavities weren't empty either. They were giving off a kind of energy signature that their equipment couldn't even classify. It was like nothing they'd ever seen. But perhaps one of the most bizarre features of these spherical cavities is that, I guess, these spherical spaces will shift positions. And in probably the craziest twist, they found recordings from an old military listening post that had been operating in the area back in '72. And on the morning Dawn's plane vanished, they had picked up a very strange sound. When they cleaned up the audio and analyzed it, they found it wasn't just a random noise, it was actually a pattern. A repeating pattern that matched the exact energy signatures they were now detecting from these spheres. Now, to this day, nobody really knows what happened to Dawn's plane or any of the other 16,000 plus people who have vanished and continue to vanish in Alaska's Bermuda Triangle. The official explanation is still that these were all just accidents. People getting lost and not finding their way back, or planes going down in bad weather. But for the people who've looked into this and have seen things that are going on, they're convinced that something very eerie is going on, something that science can't explain. And in fact, the rate of disappearances has actually increased in recent years, and it's kind of like whatever these spherical cavities are, they're becoming more active. But unfortunately, with the little information we have on all of this, it just remains one giant mystery. This next one has a happy ending, fortunately. A nice pair with the last segment that goes to show you can't ever be too prepared to go off into the wilderness, no matter how experienced you think you are. On the morning of June 11th, 2024, a 34-year-old landscaper named Lucas McClish was standing in his kitchen in Boulder Creek, California, packing up his backpack for what he thought was going to be just a quick 3-hour hike in Big Basin Redwoods State Park. Lucas had lived for being outdoors. He was a very experienced backpacker, and his actual job was working as a landscaper in the forest that had been damaged by fires, so he knew exactly what he was doing out there. And that morning, he was actually feeling pretty excited because he had this new trail route that he had planned. And so as he's getting ready, he's just throwing a few basic things in his bag, just his pants, hiking shoes, a hat, a flashlight, and this little Leatherman tool. And his mom, who he lived with, she kind of pokes her head in the kitchen and reminds him about their big Father's Day dinner coming up that weekend. And, Lucas just kind of laughs and tells her not to worry, that this is just going to be a quick morning hike. Now, normally when Lucas would go hiking, he'd pack way more gear, but this time he's just thinking, you know what, I know these trails like the back of my hand. I've been hiking here since I was a kid. I work here. What could possibly go wrong on a 3-hour hike, right? What Lucas didn't realize was that forest was not the same. Back in 2020, this massive fire called the CZU Lightning Complex had just torn through Big Basin. We're talking like 97% of the entire park had burned. And so 4 years later, about 24% of that forest was actually alive and growing back. So he drives out to the park, he parks his car, and starts heading down this trail he's hiked probably 100 times before. But about after an hour of walking, something starts feeling off. The trail markers that he usually uses to navigate, they're gone. And all these familiar trees that he's used to use as landmarks, they're either burned down or they just look different now. And soon, Lucas is looking around and he's realizing he can't really tell where he is anymore. All the canyons and ridges that used to be so distinct, they all kind of look the same. It's just this sea of black tree trunks and new undergrowth. And now Lucas can feel a knot forming in his stomach because he's realizing that maybe he's actually lost. And as the afternoon began turning into dusk, he was still trying to convince himself that he wasn't lost. He kept telling himself, this is my familiar territory. I know what I'm doing, but as it got closer to nighttime and the temperature was dropping, Lucas knew he didn't have a whole lot of time. He had to figure things out pretty quickly. So he decided his best move would be to try and make a fire. And so he gathers up whatever dry brush he can, but there's a problem. Everything around him is just soaking wet from all this new growth that's come up since the fire, and no matter what he tries, he just can't get anything to light. And so now he's just sitting there in the dark, and he's getting really cold. His clothes are getting damp from all this wet brush he's been handling, and he's looking around at all these burned out trees, and they're making these weird shadows in the moonlight. Now suddenly, this place that he thought he knew so well feels totally alien to him, and at some point during that first night, he heard movement off in the distance in the darkness. Hoping for the best, he thought it might be a deer, but as he could hear it getting closer, he realized he could potentially be in danger. And so he shined his flashlight in that direction, and he saw these two eyes reflecting back at him. And right away, he knew this was a mountain lion. Now, even though he had dealt with mountain lions before, he knew they weren't usually aggressive towards humans, but he also knew that if they started following you, well, that's generally not a good sign. And this one, it just kept staying at the edge of his flashlight, just watching him. And by the time morning came, Lucas was exhausted and cold and thirsty. He hadn't packed any water because, remember, this was supposed to be just a quick hike. But he could hear this creak somewhere down in the canyon. And so he starts making his way down there, and the whole time he's walking, he just keeps looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this mountain lion following him. Now, when he finally made it down to the creek, he realized he had another big problem. He didn't have anything to drink the water with. And so, thinking quickly, he takes off his hiking boot and he starts using it like a cup to scoop up water. You could imagine how silly he probably felt drinking out of the creek with his boot, thinking that if people saw him, he'd lost his mind. But, when you're in that situation, you gotta do what you gotta do. And so after this, all the days kind of just blended together. Lucas would just wake up covered in wet leaves that he had used as a makeshift blanket, and his whole body would be aching from the lack of sleep and trying to sleep on the hard ground. And every morning he'd have this moment where he just kept telling himself, today's the day I figure this out. Today's the day I get out of here. But the thing about being lost is that your mind starts playing tricks on you. And several times Lucas would swear he could see something in the distance that looked familiar, and he'd get all excited thinking he knew where he was, but then he'd get closer and realize it was just another burned out tree trunk that looked like every other tree trunk around him. And even the mountain lion never left. It just kept pacing and following and stalking Lucas because he would catch glimpses of it throughout the day. And even at nighttime, he could hear it moving and pacing around, but never trying to attack him. Now, during the course of this experience, he started having these conversations with this mountain lion in his head, like maybe if he could somehow reason with it, it would just leave him alone. Back at home, Lucas's mother was starting to get really worried. She had this big Father's Day dinner all planned out. She'd made his favorite lasagna, bought this special wine, the whole shebang, the family coming over. But when Sunday night came around and Lucas didn't show up, she realized something was horribly wrong, because this was not like him at all. And so she called the police that night, and when she told them her son was missing in the Big Basin, they immediately knew how serious this was. Ever since the fire in 2020, they'd been getting more and more calls about people getting lost. The whole landscape had just changed so much, and pretty soon there were like 300 people out looking for Lucas. They even had the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office, Cal Fire, the Boulder Creek Fire Department, state parks, everybody was out there searching. But the problem is the park is so huge, 18,000 acres, and most of it looks exactly the same now. Just these black trees and new undergrowth everywhere you look. Meanwhile, Lucas was really starting to realize the situation he was in. Fortunately though, He'd been drinking about a gallon of water a day from that creek, using his boot as a cup and eating whatever berries he could find that he knew were safe. But he could feel himself getting exponentially weaker. His clothes were constantly wet, and he was starting to get these weird shivers that wouldn't go away. And by day 8, he was in real trouble. He'd fallen on this rock face and banged himself up pretty bad, and now he was starting to get these symptoms of hypothermia. His thoughts were getting fuzzy, and he kept having these moments where he couldn't remember if he was actually lost or if this was all just some strange dream. And by this point, Lucas had started thinking maybe it wasn't even real anymore. The mountain lion. Maybe his mind was just making it up, because how could this same animal have been following him and stalking him for over a week? But then he'd hear it or catch a glimpse of it through the trees and he'd know it was still there. It was almost like he was having delusions. And at some point he began actively calling out for help, and he'd just start yelling until his voice was completely gone. Back in Boulder Creek, Lucas's mother was just beside herself. She hadn't slept in days. She kept going into his room and looking at all his hiking gear, trying to figure out what he might have taken with him. And she just kept thinking about that morning and how he just laughed when she reminded him about Father's Day. But finally, on June 21st, day 10, one of the search teams heard something. It was about 3 in the afternoon, and they picked up what sounded like someone calling for help. But the sound was so weak, they couldn't tell where it was coming from. They actually had to deploy these drones with special audio equipment just to try and pinpoint where the voice was coming from. Now, at about 7:30 that night, 2 park rangers found him. Lucas was just sitting there on the ground, his clothes all torn up, covered in mud, still holding on to that flashlight he'd brought with him. And the first thing he said to them when they found him wasn't about being rescued or about how happy he was. He actually asked, "Did you see it? Did you see the mountain lion?" But when they got Lucas to the hospital and checked him out, besides being dehydrated and having lost some weight, he was fine. Just some minor injuries, a lost voice, nothing major. The doctors couldn't believe it, of course. This guy had spent 10 days lost in one of the most challenging environments imaginable, being stalked by a mountain lion, and he'd managed to keep himself alive. Now, for me, the biggest mystery to this entire story is the fact that this place that he thought he knew so well had become something completely different. That fire had changed everything. The landmarks, the trails, even the way sound moved. It was all changed. Now, a few weeks go by, and he was sitting in his kitchen, which was the same place where he'd packed his bag for that 3-hour hike, and he had tried to explain to his mom what it had been like out there. And after talking to his mom for a little while, he began to tell her about the mountain lion. And he said that by the end, he actually felt like that mountain lion was the only thing keeping him sane, because everything else in that forest had changed so much, but at least the mountain lion was real and it was constant. He could see it, he could hear it. It became like this weird companion in a way. In a strange turn of events, search teams would later tell Lucas that he'd actually walked in a huge circle. Even though he thought he was heading towards the ocean, following the sun, he'd basically just been going around and around this one area of the park. As it turns out, he was less than 2 miles from a major trail the whole time. To this day, he still goes out hiking like normal, but obviously he packs a lot more efficiently. However, whether the mountain lion was truly stalking him or not, or whether it really was just a figment of his imagination due to dehydration and hallucinations, that will remain a mystery. One of the scariest things seen by hikers and hunters alike are what's being described as these horrific upright canines in the woods of North America, often referred to as Dogman. The sheer volume of eyewitness accounts is bothersome, like this one. On a cold winter night in late 2017, a man named Neil Anderson was sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the DuPont Conservation Area in Pike County, Missouri. Now, this part of Missouri is basically just forest and swampland as far as you can see. The town near there only had about 30 people living in it. So at that point, it's kind of just a village. And the conservation area itself used to be this old powder plant, but now it's just this huge stretch of wilderness that covers something like 10,000 acres. Neil had been there that night collecting sassafras and walnut leaves, which was something he did pretty regularly. He'd been wildcrafting in these woods for years and knew exactly what normal wildlife behavior looked like. I mean, he could tell you how a raccoon was going to react when you spotted it, or what a deer would do if you startled it. In fact, It all started about 2 months earlier, and Neil would be out in the woods and he'd hear these really strange whistling sounds. He kind of just ignored it initially, figured it was probably just some bird or something, but then one night, he and a good friend of his, Don, were out there and they heard what sounded like 6 or 7 owl calls, all coming from the exact same tree. Neil knew that's not how owls behave. They don't just sit there making call after call like that. And then things got stranger. They'd be walking through the woods and rocks would just come flying out of nowhere, like someone was chucking them, but whenever they'd shine their lights in that direction, there was nothing. And then they began noticing strange sounds, like something would be following them, matching their movements exactly. When they walked, it walked. When they stopped, it stopped. And this had been going on for weeks. And even Neil had even installed these big light bars on his truck because whatever this was, it seemed to stay just outside of wherever the light could reach. And Neil was actually trying to recreate those weird whistling sounds they'd been hearing, kind of like testing to see if anything would respond. When Don, who was sitting next to him in the passenger seat, suddenly grabbed Neil's arm and pointed out the windshield because about 65 yards down the parking lot, there was something moving. Initially, Neil thought it was just a coyote because it was down on all fours, but it was so big. And the way this thing was moving, he had never seen anything like that before. It was almost like it was slinking or slithering across the ground. It was very strange. And Neil and Don sat there watching this thing and noticed it had a really weird looking mane, kind of like in dreadlocks, but the rest of its body had this short, mangy looking hair. When Neil's headlights hit its eyes, they reflected back this deep reddish color. And that's really the first time they saw the full size of it. This thing was easily twice the size of a full-grown German Shepherd, even when it was down on all fours. Then, it suddenly just stood up straight on 2 legs. And Neil begins to panic and he's thinking, oh my gosh, this has got to be 7 or 8 feet tall. And before Neil or Don could do anything, this thing just takes off running towards the woods. But the way it ran was very bizarre. It cleared this 2-foot drop off into the floodplain like it was nothing, and then just vanished entirely into the darkness. At that point, both men were so terrified they did not even remember starting the truck and driving out of there. The next thing they remember is they were flying down the dirt road trying to get back to their house. And the whole time, they kept looking in their rearview mirror because they had this feeling that this thing was following them. They're nearly panicking to the point of not being able to drive properly, and at one point almost went off in a ditch because they thought they saw something moving in the trees alongside the road. Neil finally got back to his house, and he couldn't even talk right. His wife said later that when he came through the door, his face was completely white. He just kept pacing back and forth in the kitchen, trying to explain what he'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. He ended up getting physically sick that night and vomited twice. The following day, he went back out to that parking lot, but this time he brought his German Shepherd with him. And he wanted to get some perspective on just how big this thing really was. And standing there in the daylight looking at his dog, he just got the chills because his German Shepherd looked so tiny compared to what they'd seen the night before. And Neil took notice to something else that really bothered him. The way his dog's back legs were shaped, the muscle structure, the hocks, it was the same shape as what they'd seen on that thing, just on a much smaller scale. The night after seeing it, Neil couldn't sleep at all either. He just kept replaying it over and over in his head, and what made it worse was that later on, he found out that some campers who were staying near that conservation area, they'd heard this strange growling sound. It wasn't like any animal they'd ever heard, it was this deep noise that just didn't sound natural. And over the course of the following few months, other people began reporting hearing the same kind of growling. And oddly, nobody ever saw what was actually making these sounds. It's like whatever it was, it only showed itself to Neil and Don that night. From that point forward, when deer hunting or going out in the woods, Neil decided to equip himself appropriately. And his kids, who used to be able to play outside after dark, doesn't happen anymore. And roughly 6 months after his experience, that just made everything even more bizarre, Neil was over at Don's house one evening, and they were talking about what they'd seen that night. And Don, who'd been pretty quiet about the whole thing up until then, he suddenly tells Neil that something recently happened to him. Don said that back in 1972, when he was just a teenager, he'd seen the exact same thing. But it was during all those famous Momo sightings that happened 6 miles south of where Neil and Don had their original experience. Even though Don had never told anyone about what he'd seen back then, he was adamant that he was being completely honest, and he'd kept it to himself for almost 45 years until that night with Neil in the parking lot. Unfortunately, just a few weeks after telling Neil this, Don passed away, and he took most of what he knew about that 1972 sighting to his grave. Neil has tried to make sense of what they saw that night. He's looked into all kinds of possibilities. The devil monkey, skinwalker, even wondered if it was the same Momo creature from the 70s, but the one thing Neil keeps coming back to is just how evil this thing felt, and claimed it wasn't just like seeing a strange animal. There was something about it that felt supernatural, like it wasn't supposed to exist. And now, Neil has all kinds of trail cameras set up in those woods, because he's trying to catch this thing on video, but so far, nothing. It's like this thing knows exactly where those cameras are and just stays far enough away from them. And the only evidence he's got is what he and Don saw that night, and now Don's gone. To this day, Neil still goes out in those woods, he still does his wildcrafting, he still hunts, but he's always looking over his shoulder. After all, some things are better left alone. This next segment, we're going to jump back to Alaska, to a location with a strange energy and an even stranger history. What can I say? I'll just let the story speak for itself. On the night of May 19th, 2007, a 23-year-old Navy sailor named Marcus Chen walked into the lobby of the Alaskan Hotel in downtown Juneau. The hotel was this beautiful 3-story building that had been around since 1913, and it was actually the oldest operating hotel in all of Juneau. When Marcus got to the front desk, he specifically asked for what he called the haunted room. The front desk clerk kind of looked at him funny, but Marcus was very serious. He had heard all these stories about this hotel being haunted, and he wanted to experience it for himself. The clerk ended up giving Marcus room 315, and as he walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor, he passed by all these old black and white photographs showing what the hotel looked like back in the gold rush days. The wooden steps creaked under his feet as he made his way up. And around 11:45 that night, guests on the 3rd floor began calling down to the front desk saying they were hearing all this commotion coming from room 315. And so the night manager went upstairs to check it out, but when he got to Marcus's door, it was locked and Marcus wouldn't answer. The manager was about to use his key to open the door when suddenly there was this huge crash of breaking glass. And by the time the manager got inside room 315, the window was completely shattered and Marcus was gone. He had jumped out the 3rd story window. When police arrived a few minutes later, Officer Chris Gifford walked into room 315 and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The walls were covered in blood. There were handprints everywhere, like Marcus had been desperately trying to get away from something. But the strangest thing was, when they found Marcus on the ground outside, while he was injured from the fall, he didn't have nearly enough cuts or wounds to explain all the blood in the room. The next morning, the hotel owner at the time, Betty Adams, was dealing with Navy investigators who showed up to look into what happened. But instead of focusing on Marcus's injuries or the broken window, they kept asking really specific questions about the history of room 315. They wanted to know about any other incidents in that room. And then Marcus's mother called the hotel from Arizona, and she was hysterical, saying that her son had called her right before the incident. He had told her there was something in the room with him, something that would not let him leave. Now, when they checked the phone records later, there was no record of any call being made from that room. The morning after Marcus jumped out that window, Jill Weitz, who was working at the hotel through AmeriCorps, showed up for her morning shift, and she had no idea what had happened the night before. But as soon as she walked in, she saw all these officers in the lobby and the hotel manager, Scott Fry, who was talking to them, and his face was just totally white. And when Jill went up to the 3rd floor to start her usual cleaning rounds, she saw that room 315 was blocked off with police tape. And even though she couldn't go inside, she could see through the doorway doorway that the walls were just covered in this dark red blood. But there was something else. The blood was arranged. It wasn't like random splatter. It almost looked like someone had been writing. Now, Scott, who had been managing the hotel for about 12 years at this point, had actually pulled Jill aside later that day and told her this. He said that over the past decade, multiple guests in room 315 had reported waking up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was sitting on their chest, holding them down. Although nothing violent had ever happened before. A couple days after this, the housekeeping staff was finally allowed to enter and clean room 315. The head housekeeper, Maria, had been working there for over 15 years, and she'd seen some strange things, but she even claimed this was different. As they were cleaning the room, all their supplies kept disappearing and then reappearing in different places. At one point, Maria set down her cleaning bucket, turned around for just a second, and when she looked back, the bucket was empty. All the supplies were lined up perfectly straight on the other side of the room. And the really strange thing was, after they finished cleaning and replaced the broken window, the hotel started getting all these calls from people specifically requesting that same room, 315. Word had gotten out about what happened with Marcus, and now people wanted to experience whatever he had experienced. But the hotel staff noticed something had changed after this whole incident. The strange activity that used to be mostly confined to 315 started spreading to other parts of the hotel. Housekeepers would find items moved around in rooms that had been empty and locked. Guests would report hearing footsteps in the hallway at night, but when they looked out, no one was there. And so about a week after the Marcus incident, Betty Adams was sitting in her office just trying to figure out what to do about all of this. And she had owned the Alaskan Hotel since 1974, and she'd always kind of kept quiet about any strange things that had happened there. I mean, she didn't want to scare business away. But now, with the story and all the local papers, she was getting calls every day from reporters wanting to know about other haunted rooms, like room 218. In fact, back in 1985, there was this businessman who had checked into room 218 for just one night. And he was a very skeptical man who didn't believe in anything supernatural. Around 2 in the morning, he came running down to the front desk in his pajamas. Pajamas? Or is it pajamas? Totally white as a sheet, and he told Betty that he had woken up to find a woman in an old-fashioned dress sitting at the edge of his bed, just staring at him. And so when he turned on his light, she was gone, but the impression of someone sitting on the bed was still there. And then there's, of course, room 219, and the housekeepers absolutely refused to clean that room alone. Maria, the head housekeeper, had told Betty about in 1996 when she was making the bed in 219, she had just finished putting on fresh sheets when suddenly all 4 corners of the fitted sheet just popped off the mattress at the exact same time, like someone had lifted up all 4 corners at once. Maria claimed there's no way that could happen naturally, but what really bothered her was the bar area. This hotel had this beautiful old bar with all these antique mirrors behind it. And lately, customers and bartenders had been seeing things in those mirrors. They'd see people walking behind them in the reflection, and when they turned around, of course, nobody was there. And sometimes, glasses would just slide right off the bar by themselves, like someone had pushed them. In fact, one night in early June, about 3 weeks after the Marcus incident had taken place, Betty was closing up the bar by herself, and she was counting the till when she heard this sound coming from upstairs. It was like someone walking in high heels on the wooden floors. Well, the problem is she knew all the guests were checked in for the night, so she went up to investigate. And as she walked up the stairs that night, she really began thinking about something she hadn't in a long time. Because back in 1916, there was this young woman who at the time had come to stay at the hotel while her husband was out mining. And the husband had told her he'd only be gone about 3 weeks. But 3 turned into 4 and then 5, and pretty soon, this woman had run out of money to pay for her room. And during this time, the hotel wasn't just a hotel. The 3rd floor had actually been a bordello during the gold rush days. And so this woman, desperate to keep her room, she eventually started working upstairs. And she figured she'd do it just long enough to pay her bills until her husband came back. But then one day, her husband did come back. He had struck gold and rushed back to surprise her, but when he found out what his wife had been doing, he lost it. Now, no one knows exactly what happened after that, but the woman was never seen again. And even though Betty dismissed this story as local folklore, she truly began to wonder in this moment if she was encountering the spirit of that dead woman. The sound of the high heels were just too uncanny. And most disturbingly, it was coming from room 218, which was the exact room where that businessman had seen the woman in the old-fashioned dress. So Betty gets to room 218 and she knows it's empty because no one had checked in there that night. But she can clearly hear movement inside. And so she puts her key in the lock, turns it, opens the door, and the room is pitch black except for the strange red glow coming from the old mirror mounted on the wall. And when Betty opened the door and saw that red glow, she screamed because reflected in that mirror, she could see the entire room was filled with people in old-fashioned clothing, like something straight out of the early 1900s. And so she quickly turned around to look in the room, but it was empty. Now, after that night, Betty would in fact go down to the Juneau Historical Society and kind of going through all these old newspapers from the early 1900s. In the Juneau Empire newspaper from October 1916, there was this tiny article, and it talked about how a miner had come back to town and discovered his wife working in the Alaskan Hotel. Now, according to this, there had been some kind of disturbance, but when police arrived, they couldn't find either the miner or his wife. Now, the article mentioned that other guests had reported hearing screaming coming from room 218, but nothing was ever found. The case was just left unsolved. Now, interestingly, after learning this, when she went back to the hotel, she started talking to all of her employees about this strange story she just read. And even the housekeepers talked about how they'd sometimes find room 218's bed completely made up with these really old-fashioned sheets that the hotel didn't even own. And the maintenance guy would mention how the mirror in room 218 would somehow end up crooked every morning, no matter how many times it was straightened. However, one of the most interesting and probably strangest connections was from the Navy investigators. Now, at this point, Betty hadn't received their report yet, but after, it mentioned that right before Marcus jumped out the window, he had been screaming about a woman in an old dress who was trying to push him out. The same type of woman that had been seen in room 218 all those years ago. Now today, this hotel is still open for business and Betty still owns it, but she's stopped trying to hide its haunted history. She just figures people are going to find out anyway. The hotel's even been featured on TV shows like the Alaskan Triangle and Portals to Hell. But Betty says that the TV shows never get the whole story right. They always focus on the big scares and the dramatic moments. They never talk about the quiet things, like how sometimes in the middle of the night, you can hear a woman just sobbing in the hallway, or how the bartenders sometimes find old-fashioned coins from like 1910 sitting on the bar in the morning. And room 218? Well, it's still the most requested room in the hotel. But Betty has a pretty strict policy about allowing anyone in there, and not because of the fear of ghosts, but for the fear of what guests might do to themselves when they realize they're not alone. Now, since doing this channel and researching these bizarre cases, I've come across many strange sightings. However, I would have to say the strangest of all is the cases I found in Robert Rosales' humanoid encounter database. These are by far some of the most out there accounts I've ever read, and that's exactly where this next segment comes from. This next story, which was researched and investigated by Albert Rosales and comes from his 2000 to 2009 book, documents one of the most bizarre stories I've personally ever read. As crazy as it sounds, it's what's in the report. On January 12th, 2008, in the Dubno-Rovno region of Ukraine, a 34-year-old man named Vladimir Voronsky and his 29-year-old wife Olga were at home enjoying time with their young children. In the evening, Vladimir asked his two daughters, 9-year-old Vanessa and 8-year-old Angelica, to run to a nearby store to pick up some supplies. Both daughters were given some money, and after a huge hug from their mom and dad, they went. On their way back from the store, both girls were giggling and playing a game on the side of the road when one of them noticed an unusually bright object in the sky. Frightened by this, both girls ran home and immediately told their parents what they had seen. It was so huge, they exclaimed to both their parents. However, their mother, Olga, wasn't buying their flying star story. The girls were adamant that this wasn't a satellite or anything of that nature. It It was round and flashed different colors. They even drew pictures of what they saw, and despite both of them going into different rooms to draw these pictures, the drawings were nearly identical. Vladimir and Olga were perplexed by this and decided to go have a look outside later that evening. They both looked around in the sky but couldn't see much, and then, in the distance, they could make out a strange, hovering object over a nearby river. It appeared to move and change shapes before their eyes. Vladimir and Olga were astonished because this had to have been what their daughter saw earlier. Even though it was in the distance, Olga successfully managed to take a photo of this object. Unfortunately, because of how cell phones were in 2008, it just didn't turn out great. And after a few minutes of discussing what it could be, they gave up, decided to head back inside to eat supper and go to bed. Around 2 in the morning, Vladimir was awakened by a strange sensation in his body. The room was lit up by this strange whitish violet light. Immediately, he began to panic and turn to Olga and was shaking her, trying to wake her up, screaming her name, completely unsure of what was happening. But Olga was in such a deep sleep that she could only mumble a few words about how he had probably been dreaming and that he should go back to sleep. Somehow, convinced he was having some sort of lucid dream, he ignored the light and miraculously managed to go back to sleep. However, Angelica, their 8-year-old daughter, was sleeping in a room nearby when a strange orange light so bright that it irritated her face and eyes woke her from her sleep. Terrified, she ran to her parents' room, screaming and crying, trying to do her best to wake her mother. Olga awoke and then did her best to comfort her inconsolable daughter while trying to wake her sleeping husband when she noticed something above her. She and Angelica looked up and they both started screaming. Vladimir was now awake and looked up too. All three of them saw that the ceiling had completely disappeared. It was totally transparent, and right over them they could clearly see the open sky. And in direct view was this huge disc-shaped craft hovering no more than a few hundred feet above their home. Vladimir and his wife jumped out of bed, ran outside their house in only their nightgowns, and this craft had moved roughly 100 meters from the house, illuminating this strange white light. Suddenly, both Olga and Vladimir were unable to move. Their bodies were frozen, and everything around them began reflecting this weird light. Vladimir saw his wife slowly ascend into the air, zooming up in this strange kind of spiral motion. And he felt his body able to move and attempted to grab her leg to pull her back, but felt he just didn't have the strength. Vladimir did his best to try to pull her down, but it seemed like she was in a trance. She was clearly going into shock at the events taking place. Olga did not hear her husband screaming her name. Both of them became engulfed in this blinding light that surrounded them indefinitely. The next thing they realized was that both of them were okay. And inside this strange, foreign, white room of some kind that really lacked anything. The walls were equally strange. They were kind of like glass, but transparent. Vladimir and Olga were trying to understand where they were and what had just happened to them, when directly in front of them were these strange-looking beings. They were roughly the height of their 9-year-old daughter. Each had 3 fingers on their hands with these strange, large, bulbous heads and gray skin. And additionally, Vladimir and Olga also noticed the other features these beings lacked. They didn't appear to have any mouths or ears, but Olga and Vladimir were just so lost in their large, cumbersome black eyes that seemed to absorb everything around them. These humanoids appeared to have no visible legs and were almost moving around like caterpillars. They had these tiny little suckers under their long, fitting suits that kind of gave them the impression that they were floating instead of walking. These shorter versions of these things approached Olga. They grabbed her, moved her to another section of the room, and placed her in a deep-looking armchair resembling a gynecologist chair. Despite their reassurance that nothing would happen, Vladimir got angry. He began to violently push these beings back, and to do everything he could to reach his wife, they grabbed at his arms and his legs to restrain him. However, because Vladimir was a professional wrestler and a martial arts expert, he used various techniques to free himself. With all the strength he could, he would kick the entities off of him, but it was useless. They would immediately come back at him like a boomerang and grab onto him. And they would talk to him telepathically, asking why he was resisting. And each time they spoke into his mind, they would just stare straight into his eyes with those terrifying black soulless orbs. And even their tone was terrifying because it was neither aggressive nor irritated. Vladimir described the voice he had heard inside his head had no accent or timbre of any kind and was primarily in the Ukrainian language. They even spoke to him in Syriac, which is a mixture of Ukrainian and Russian. The things that Vladimir experienced next felt like they were straight out of a nightmare. These strange beings restrained him, brought him over to this large metallic slab where they inserted 4 metallic rods into his chest that paralyzed him completely. After this, he was unable to move. All he could do was lie there helplessly and watch as these things began to experiment on his wife close by. Several of them surrounded Olga and gestured to her to lie down. Quickly and without her noticing, they were able to make an incision on her stomach where they could open her up and begin observing her internal organs. As this was happening, she was completely shocked because she could look down and see her organs, but somehow she felt no pain. And actually, somehow, she only felt complete and utter relaxation. The beings seemed to almost be materializing these strange-looking instruments, taking samples from inside her body. Olga later described the smell of her own internal organs as unpleasant. And once they appeared to be finished, they closed the incision, they sewed up her stomach using what appeared to be some type of advanced biomolecular technology. There was no scar left behind. The entire time this operation was taking place, they kept mind-speaking to her and attempted to calm her down. They asked her how she felt and if she was in any pain. They told her point blank, "Look, we're not going to harm you, we're just looking." It was very odd because it was always in a very polite manner. Creepy. From there, these beings shifted their focus onto Vladimir. They subjected him to similar medical experiments, like pushing a strange pistol-like object into his head, and like his wife, he felt no pain when this happened. After the tests were completed, he was taken into a separate room to speak to a taller humanoid, loosely referred to as a professor. The telepathic communication going on during this interaction is very fascinating because Vladimir explained that if they cannot convey what they were trying to explain to him with words, they would use imagery and symbols that would appear in his mind. For example, they explained to Vladimir that their society was like a giant ant colony, where every person, or I guess being in this case, was a part of the collective and had a defined role. Folks, if you think this story is wild now, it gets even stranger. Olga and Vladimir were quickly taken and placed on these large armchairs where they saw that everything around them was transparent. This meant they could easily see stars and planets in every direction. Vladimir could see the sun, which he described as a diffused ball of light, and he saw the earth, which was very far away and resembled a tennis ball. Only moments later, both of them saw this bright, blinding flash of light, followed by an intense wave of nausea. Then, he saw that their craft was now directly above an unknown planet they had never seen before. After this, both were quickly ushered into another room, which resembled an airlock or dock of some kind, and they were placed inside a smaller craft similar to a cigar shape. From here, Olga and Vladimir were separated from what they could only understand as the mothership, and shortly after that, entered the atmosphere and flew over the planet's surface. As this happened, Vladimir looked down and could see this strange terrain. He noticed these large open pits on the surface. It appeared that whatever lived here primarily lived underground in this subterranean hive. It was revealed to Vladimir that this place was referred to as the Andromeda Nebula. Vlad was told that because this race of beings didn't eat or drink in the usual manner that humans did, but instead absorbed the elements more universally, this is what made human beings so appealing. And the fact that they have feelings and emotion that this race of beings do not possess. Shortly after all of this, they were brought back to the main ship outside where another bright flash of light occurred and they were over another planet. Vladimir was extremely confused by how they were traveling so fast and what was going on, and was told that because these beings could not move faster than the speed of light, they instead traveled through tears in space or black holes. Now, here is where they proposed that Vladimir enter into sexual contact with a female humanoid of their species, which had now appeared in the room. However, due to her grotesque appearance, Vladimir simply explained that there was no way he could do that. Then, they accompanied this female to what was described as a small round platform, and this column of light unexpectedly appeared. The very next moment, this grotesque-looking female alien walked out, but with a completely different appearance. She resembled a beautiful young woman from Earth. While her body was covered by what appeared to be this sort of white sheet, her face had very sharp features and she had dark hair, exactly to Vladimir's taste. He would later realize that they had penetrated into his mind and had materialized the ideal look and attractiveness of a woman for him. As Vladimir and this shape-shifted being began to have intercourse, Olga, who was right there and can watch the entire thing happen, began reacting and became hysterical. She was screaming for these aliens to stop all of it now, to which they became confused and told her through their mind that humans always mate together sexually, so what's the issue here? Her only retort was that people don't just mate, but have feelings and emotions. And after seeing his wife's visceral reaction, Vladimir restrained himself further. Vladimir and Olga were informed that these beings' sole aim was to teach Earthlings about extraterrestrial technology. They explained that some sort of space war was happening in the universe, and most disturbingly of all, said this to Vladimir verbatim.
The entity that you call God has implanted much information into Earth and into the waters of it. Those who are against God want that information destroyed. If the Earth is going to be destroyed, the Son of God will arrive to Earth again and will restore everything living on it.
Eventually, the couple returned to Earth the same way they had been taken. But before returning them, these beings promised to return in 2 years, which would be 2010. Olga and Vladimir lost consciousness. At 11 a.m. the following morning, both awoke and had not spoken about what had happened for a while. They were both thoroughly convinced that they had just had this crazy lucid nightmare of some kind. Still, after finally talking about what had happened and scrutinizing all the mutual identical memories, they realized it wasn't a dream, but had actually happened. Within a short amount of time, Vladimir was put in contact with a researcher by the name of Yuri Stepanov, who, after hypnotically regressing Vladimir in February of 2008, was able to gather additional details. Vladimir drew a picture of the craft that had taken them, including the lights and its circumference. He also drew sketches of the beings that he interacted with. He also recalled how while in space, the craft he had been in was surrounded by a layer of plasma, which he understood made the object invisible to the human eye and prevented it from radar detection. The entire family underwent extensive medical testing, but nothing unusual was found. However, Vladimir lost all of his gray hair, and his physical endurance increased afterward. Also strange was, before this experience, Olga was plagued by chronic stomach pain known as colitis. This disease causes inflammation of the large intestine. After they had operated on her, she was cured and never had pain again. This entire story appeared in the Fax newspaper, Kyiv, in June 20th, 2008, and also appeared on UFOstation.net and several Ukrainian TV programs. Yuri Stepanov believes that a portion of the 4,000 people that go missing every year in Ukraine are taken by the same entities that took both Vladimir and Olga. It's unknown if the entities returned in 2010. And since we're on the topic of really bizarre out there stories, the Crimean Peninsula has a sinister history of Russian military encountering things in the sea they just can't explain. While the next individual in this segment isn't military, his account aligns with the many strange tales you can read about in this same peninsula. On the evening of August 18th, 1991, a professional musician named Vyacheslav Turtis visited the shoreline along Cape Aya on the Crimean Peninsula with a small group of friends. After they made a fire in the evening, they sat in the sand and told each other jokes and talked about their love lives and how good it felt to get away from their families. The entire time, Vyacheslav's attention was drawn to the water and the idea of jumping in for a night's swim. It was just so alluring to him, but he kept putting it off and putting off until finally he's like, you know what? My friends are here. I'm going to go jump in for a night's swim. Vyacheslav knew that if he was going to go into the ocean, he had to be careful because of the undercurrents, and it would be really easy for him to be swept out to sea. But because his friends were so close by, he figured if there truly was an emergency, he was near enough he could just yell for help, so it wasn't a big deal. Vyacheslav got up from around the fire, told his friends he's going to take a dip for a little while, but once he got waist deep, all of his worries and anxieties just melted away. The water, which was unusually calm and warmer than usual, almost sort of soothed Vyacheslav. And because the water was so comfortable and everything around him was calm and quiet, he ended up just relaxing for a little while. And time went on, and around 11:30 at night rolls around. His friends were relatively close by, still chatting away, and a brilliant idea came to Vyacheslav's head. He flipped on his back and allowed his body to float so he could gaze up at the full moon. Well, it wasn't long before the current took control and he pulled further away from the shore. He was so deceptively relaxed, he didn't care and was completely at peace. Suddenly, Vyacheslav goes from calm and relaxed to high alert. He isn't exactly sure what or where, but something below him had just touched him. In a sudden panic, he flipped back over to treading water so he could try and scan the water around him, but because it was so dark, he couldn't make out anything. And obviously, the water is pitch black, so there's no luck in trying to see anything. He wasn't sure why, but he felt so isolated in that moment because of how quiet it was, and the fact that the only sound he could hear was the sound of water lapping against itself. And he hadn't let his guard down yet. As he was staring off in the night, he just kept scanning his surroundings, waiting for something, anything to move. But minutes dragged on, and he saw and heard nothing except the waves and wind. Now, even though it was dark out, the moon provided enough light that if there was someone out there who was messing with him, he would be able to see them. And so he kind of quickly pivoted his body so he had a perfect view of the shoreline, and all his friends were still there laughing and sitting around telling stories around the fire. And that sight instantly brought Vyacheslav peace, and he realized that it was probably just a fish swimming by. He's clearly overreacting to the sensory deprivation of light. After a few deep breaths, he flips himself back onto his back, and his heart rate and breathing slowed down again. A few moments later, Vyacheslav heard the distinct sound of something big submerging in the water about 20 feet away. He reacted even faster this time, whirling his body around to catch whoever this prankster was, but didn't see anything except the large water ripples. This is when he realized that he wasn't going crazy, he wasn't alone. The first thing that pops into his head is that he's in danger and he needs to get back to shore now. And the next immediate thought he had was his rational brain telling himself, "You're overreacting, it was probably a piece of wood, stop being paranoid." But during the next chain of thoughts to come, he concluded with himself that no, it didn't feel like wood or the nip of a fish. Whatever touched him felt hard and pointed, like somebody jabbing him with their fingers. Splash! Immediately, as he finished that last thought, another large splash came from behind. He wasn't going to wait around anymore. He started swimming as fast as he could back to the shore. And in his mind, he's now convincing himself that he's about to be devoured by a shark because many things come up to the surface to feed at night. Did he just screw himself by drifting out this far? Well, he makes it about a good 30 or 40 feet and he feels jabbing. That same hard jabbing sensation on the back of his shoulder. And without thinking, he just reacts and whirls around, half expecting to be devoured and half expecting to see the last few seconds of his life. But that's not what happened. The only emotion Vyacheslav felt at that moment was pure shock because what he was seeing that was only arm's length away from him was an expressionless, pale woman's face just above the water. And time itself seemed to come to a full stop around him as he locked eyes with this mysterious woman. The one thing that breaks him out of this trance-like state is when this woman lifts this frail, bony white hand from beneath the water through her long hair floating around her head, and she coils her hand back like she's getting ready to strike at him again with another jab. Whatever it was about these few movements was enough to snap him out of whatever shock he had succumbed to, and he throws his arm in this woman's direction just as her hand goes in for a strike, effectively blocking it. But during that brief second of physical contact, Vyacheslav realized that whoever this woman was felt cold to the touch, and that her skin was silky and smooth and slippery, like a fish's would be. He looks back up into her eyes, and she clearly had an expression on her face of surprise that he had smacked her hand out of the way. Quickly, he turns his back on her yet again and starts swimming back to the shore faster than he's ever swam in his life. And he's swimming so hard and fast that he's intaking mouthfuls of seawater and doing everything he could not to gag and to cough, but to just keep pushing forward. The entire time this is happening, he could hear whatever this woman is behind him in a series of splashes that are mirroring his own, growing louder with each second. Which means she's not only keeping up with him, she's gaining on him. Vyacheslav can see that he's not far away from the shoreline, and he's pushing, going as hard as he can, and he knows that at any moment he's going to feel the shore beneath his feet, where he can wade back on a dry land if he could only just go a little further. And then suddenly, he feels this immense force on his back that shoves him forward in the water, causing him to nearly lose his balance, but he feels nothing but relief come over him because underneath his feet is solid ground, which means that at this point, he's only roughly chest deep and could wade back to the shoreline. I don't know if this was because he was reacting out of fight or flight or what, but on his way back to the shore, he glances over his shoulder and notices some very disturbing details about this mysterious woman. Her eyes are much larger than any human's, and they actually produced this soft glow under the moonlight that had illuminated her entire face. It was like her very eyes were bioluminescent. But unlike the last story, where whatever creature the diver had encountered clearly had malicious intent, this mysterious woman had an expression of disappointment at the fact that Vyacheslav reached the shore and hastily exited the water. However, all this happened so fast because as Vyacheslav was exiting, his friends came running over yelling to him, asking if he was all right because they all saw how fast and how panicked he was swimming back to the shoreline, but none of them saw the mysterious woman in the water. He was so focused on getting back that he told his friends he never once heard them screaming his name and yelling to him. But his friends did notice a strange glimmer shining out there in the waves behind Vyacheslav, and they weren't sure what it was. Within moments, they had thrown a blanket around him, handed him a bottle of vodka, and before he knew it, he was retelling his friends by the campfire exactly what had happened out there in the waves. Because his experience was so strange, none of his friends believed him entirely. But interestingly, weeks after this happened to Vyacheslav, he had these vivid and horrific nightmares of those strange eyes rising from beneath the waters, rushing up to him to drag him beneath. But despite the nightmares, there was something about them that beckoned him back to the ocean. And he came back to that same spot on the beach multiple times, and he'd look out in the ocean in hopes he would see those eyes again. And even stranger is there were nights Vyacheslav even swam out to that same spot, hoping she would show herself. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, depending on how you look at it, he never did see this strange pale woman in the water again. Vyacheslav's experience and what he encountered that evening in August of 1991 will remain unknown. So, the first time I ever heard about this next segment was actually from my own mother many years ago, long before I started this channel. It's an account that's been public for a while now, and like the last couple, it's just flat out terrifying. You start listening to these long enough and you just really start questioning what even is reality. On a beautiful, warm August morning in 1980, a 32-year-old man named Larry Kelm pulled his pickup truck into a small dirt parking area near Eugene, Oregon. He stepped out of his truck, adjusted his backpack, and began walking toward the trailhead of the Old Malala Indian Trail, which connected Mount Saddle Blanket to the nearby town of Oak Ridge. Now, the Malala Trail had been used by local tribes for centuries before European settlers ever arrived, and by 1980, it had become a very popular hiking destination, especially during the summer months when weather was really nice. The trail itself wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar, which is pretty typical of Oregon wilderness. Larry had hiked parts of this trail before, and he knew that on clear days like this, you could see all the way to the Cascade Mountains. From certain points along the ridge, the morning air was crisp, exactly what you'd expect for an August morning in the Pacific Northwest. One of Larry's favorite parts about the entire hike was that the scent of pine needles was so strong, and for several hours everything seemed completely normal. At one point, Larry began to feel very strange. The forest around him suddenly became unclear, as if he was trying to look through someone else's glasses. All the vibrant greens of the forest faded to gray, even though Larry could still see the sun overhead. It was like someone had draped a massive shadow over this section of the trail. But there was nothing above that could cast such a shadow. Larry stopped walking and blinked several times, maybe thinking something was wrong with his eyesight. But the haziness only persisted, and he looked down at his hands, and even though they appeared slightly out of focus, he knew this wasn't right. The whole world around him had become like a photograph that someone else failed to develop properly. Then, as quickly as it began, Larry passed through what felt like an invisible barrier. When his vision cleared, everything had changed. Instead of mid-morning in a familiar Oregon forest, he was what it appeared to be the middle of the night. The wind that had been blowing through the trees had stopped, and he turned in a circle, trying to get his bearings. The Douglas firs and cedars were gone, and in their place was dense, unfamiliar vegetation that reminded him like a tropical jungle rather than the Pacific Northwest. Even the air felt thick and humid. Despite there being no moon in the sky, he could still see everything around him clearly. It was as if the darkness was somehow illuminated by an unseen light. Now suddenly, a high-pitched sound cut through the air. It wasn't like anything he had ever heard before. Not a bird call or an animal cry or even machinery. The sound seemed to bore directly into his own head, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. Someone, or something, whispered the word, "Gotcha," right next to his right ear, and his entire body went cold. His heart seemed to stop for a moment, and he had to force himself to take a breath of the thick, heavy air, and he immediately began backing away, trying to retrace his steps, and as he moved backward, something reached for him from behind. Larry caught sight of it right over his shoulder, his right shoulder, a large, dark, hairy arm ending in a hand with pale, almost human-like fingernails. They appeared clean and well-maintained, but the thumb was positioned lower on the hand than a human's would be. The arm was muscular and covered in coarse black hair. Its thumb actually grazed Larry's neck as he jerked backward, but it didn't break the skin. Larry watched as the hand closed on the empty space where his throat had been just a split second before. Larry kept moving backward, and suddenly he was back in the normal world. The familiar forest surrounded him again, and he could breathe. However, something within Larry's innermost self told him to look directly ahead, and he saw what appeared to be this oval-shaped distortion in the air, very similar to the way heat waves rise from the hot pavement. This strange oval just slowly shrunk and shrunk until it vanished. Completely terrified and beside himself, he ran all the way back to his truck as fast as he could, having no idea who he was going to tell or what he was going to say. And for a long time after this, he never told anybody, but suffered from horrific nightmares from this experience. Interestingly, that same trail is still hiked by many today, but there haven't been any reported experiences like Larry's. Or should I say, not exactly. Apparently, during the summer of 1980, several hikers had reported strange magnetic anomalies around the Mount Saddle Blanket area, affecting compasses and other hiking equipment. Could this just be attributed to mineral deposits? And 3 days before Larry's experience, Jim Wilkes, who's a seasoned trail maintenance worker, was documenting highly unusual dead zones along the same section of the Molalla Trail. He had been marking trees for removal when he entered an area where his radio completely stopped working. When he stepped back about 20 feet, the radio functioned normally again. Wilkes had marked the location in his logbook to have the power lines checked for any interference, but utility workers who investigated found no electrical anomalies. The Molalla Trail was eventually rerouted slightly in 1983 for what official records listed as terrain stability concerns. However, some historians noted that this section of the trail had been specifically avoided by the Molalla tribe centuries earlier, who had marked it on their own maps as a place where the air becomes strange. Okay, so you're probably thinking I'll just never hike in the woods and I'll be safe, right? Well, not exactly. This next segment occurs too close to home for this man and his dog, and, well, I'll just let you listen to the story. On the night of February 12, 2016, a 42-year-old man named Mike Randall was sound asleep in his home in a quiet suburb just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Mike had lived in this house with his wife for about 6 years, which he had inherited from his grandfather and just hadn't lived in it until recently. And they had this large dog named Duke, who basically never barked at night. Duke was actually such a quiet dog that their neighbors would constantly comment about how well behaved he was because, unfortunately, they had some really inconsiderate neighbors a couple houses down who always let their dogs bark early in the morning, and it's just exhausting. Now, speaking of exhausting, around 3 in the morning, Mike suddenly woke up to the sound of Duke absolutely losing his mind in the backyard. At first, he just laid there in bed thinking Duke would stop, but Duke kept barking and making this strange growling sound that Mike had never heard him make. He knew something was wrong, and so he got up and walked down the hallway towards their back den, which had these big sliding glass doors that looked out onto their backyard. And when he got to the den and looked out, he could see Duke running up and down the fence line and was acting bizarre. Like he would run up to the fence, bark at something, and then would turn around and pee, and then he would run to the other spot on the fence, bark at something, turn around, pee again, and the whole time his tail was tucked between his legs, which Mike knew was a sign that Duke was terrified of something. So Mike walked right up to the glass door and he's looking out trying to figure out what Duke is barking at, and he sees something right there. About 15 feet beyond his fence line, there was this big black bass that was kind of bent over in this weird circular position. And as he's staring at this thing, he could see it had this thick mane around its neck, kind of like a lion, but this was way bigger than any lion. Mike just stood there for about maybe 15 seconds before he realizes, I gotta make sure that there's something here and that my dog's not just losing its mind. And so he ran to his garage to grab this head-mounted light he used for camping. He figured if he can get a better look at whatever this was, maybe he could figure out what he was dealing with. When he got back to the den with the light, he was actually relieved to see that this thing was still there because part of him thought maybe he had imagined it. Or perhaps it was just a large black bear. So he puts the headlamp on and he walks right up to the glass door again and he aims it directly at this black mass. And as soon as the light hits it, this thing turns its head and looks right at him. And when it did, Mike saw these bright yellow eyes reflecting back at him, and they were way too high off the ground to be any normal animal. And then before Mike could really process what he was looking at, it just takes off running along his fence line. Now, Mike later said that the way this thing moved was just impossible. I mean, this thing that was basically the size of a lion with these massive shoulders and this huge chest covered the entire length of his fence, which was roughly 50 feet, in 2 seconds. What made it even weirder was right as it started running, Mike also saw a smaller version of the same animal dart out in front of it, like it was leading the way. And like that, they were gone. The only reason he knew for sure that he wasn't hallucinating was Duke was still totally freaking out, running back and forth along the fence line. And Mike went up, woke his wife up, and told her what had just happened. But his wife, she basically just told Mike that he must have seen a couple of coyotes or something and to just come back to bed and relax. but he knew what he saw was not a coyote. I mean, this thing had pointed ears and it moved on all fours. But that's where any similarity to a normal animal ended. Now, the next morning, Mike called in sick to work to take care of Duke. He was convinced his dog was not feeling well. Duke, who was usually this really active, playful dog, just laid in the corner of the living room all day long. He wouldn't even go near the back door to go outside. And so he spent that whole day, Mike did, just pacing around his house, constantly looking out the windows into his backyard. Now, at one point, his wife came home for lunch and found Mike standing in their den, just staring out the glass door. And when she asked him what he was doing, he couldn't even really explain it to her. He just knew that whatever he had seen the night before was not normal, and he felt like he needed to keep watch. That night, after his wife had gone to bed, he sat down at his computer and he typed into Google, "huge wolves in America." And as he's scrolling through the results, he suddenly stops because he sees this cartoon drawing that looks exactly like what he had seen in his backyard. It was here he learned about something called a Dogman. And then he began noticing other weird things happening in his neighborhood. One morning, he's getting his newspaper, and a neighbor of his from across the street comes running over to him, not in the usual way to have small talk, but tells him that his cat had gone missing, which again was strange because this cat had lived inside for 10 years and had never tried to get out before. But 2 nights ago, his neighbor had heard this horrible sound coming from his backyard, and when he went to check on it the next morning, he found his back door wide open and his cat was gone. Well, a few days after that, Mike was taking out his trash when he noticed these really bizarre marks in his front yard. They looked kind of like prints, but they were just so large, they were bigger than his own hand, and they were pressed so deep into the ground that whatever made them had to have been incredibly heavy. Now, his wife was really starting to worry about her husband, and she had started sleeping on the couch in the den so he could watch the backyard. But their marriage was starting to suffer because she just couldn't understand why Mike was acting so erratic. She kept telling him that he needed to just let it go, that he had just seen some coyotes that night and that was it. But then, one night in April, Mike was watching this YouTube program, what am I, 70 years old? A YouTube video about a Dogman encounter. And this is where he had heard a story from a guy who lived in the same suburb as Mike did. And he was describing seeing the exact same thing Mike had seen. And in that moment, Mike felt totally validated because he realized he wasn't crazy, that someone else in the same county had now seen what he had. The most disturbing aspect of this entire story is the complete personality shift that Mike had, and his wife noticed the entire transformation, which seems to be a common theme in these stories of people who have these experiences where they almost lose their mind. Well, interestingly, Mike started going to the local library to look through old newspaper archives, trying to find any mention of a strange animal in their area. And eventually he did find an article from 1966. And it was about this local man who had reported seeing these 2 massive wolf-like animals running through his property in the middle of the night. And when Mike read the man's name, he didn't know what to think, because the man who had reported this sighting was a man named William Randall, which was Mike's grandfather. Now, interestingly, Mike had never heard this story before, and his grandfather had passed away when he was just a little boy. Now, what's wild is that the property in which his grandfather had his sighting on was the same property where Mike now lived. And the only reason his grandfather reported it in the news was because he had livestock at the time, and these 2 wolf-like creatures were killing a lot of his chickens and goats. So much so that he actually formed a small local posse to look for these things. Now, eventually things would settle down and Duke would go back to going outside and using the bathroom like he normally would without freaking out. And fortunately for Mike, never saw those 2 creatures again. So now you're probably thinking, okay, I won't hike or camp, I won't stay at home, I'll just get an RV or a van and find somewhere to hang out. Folks, we're in the actual X-Files here, right? And as this next segment is going to prove, things are very, very strange. On the evening of July 15th, 2023, a 23-year-old named Marcus pulled his converted Sprinter van into a dispersed camping spot right near Mount Rainier National Park. He'd just come from a van life meetup near Washington where about 30 other van lifers had gathered to share stories and compare their vehicles. Since he was so close to Mount Rainier, he figured he might as well find the perfect spot in the forest for the night. The spot he found was down a fire road about 4 miles from the entrance. Most van lifers knew these spots well because they were marked on apps shared in Facebook groups. And so Marcus pulled into a clearing and began his usual evening routine. He had all the ingredients ready to make carne asada tacos, and he downloaded some movies to watch for later. This was pretty typical. He spent most weekends camping in his van somewhere in Washington state doing this. And he was equipped well. He had a full kitchen setup with a propane stove, a sink with running water, and solar panels on the roof to power all of it. And so after parking, he decided he was going to explore the area around the campsite. Even though it was nice, there was some trash scattered like beer cans and food wrappers. But beyond that bit of trash, there seemed to be this nice little winding path that led down to the riverbank. And so he decided he was going to go explore it. Now, every half hour or so, another vehicle would drive past looking for their own camping spot. And this was pretty normal for summer evenings because a lot of people were trying to find free camping spots before dark. And so after a while of Marcus not really finding anything too exciting, he just went back to his van and started making dinner. And with the sun low enough in the sky where it's dark now, and he already contacted his family to let him know where he was, he began hearing some odd noises. It sounded like cannon fire, deep, booming sounds that would kind of just reverberate through the valley every few seconds. Along with that came what sounded like a chainsaw, closer but still far away enough that he couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Now, he wasn't immediately alarmed because just living in the area, he knew it wasn't too unusual to hear gunshots while camping. I mean, lots of people shoot guns out in target practice in these areas, and well, chainsaws are fairly common too, people cutting firewood. Now, one of the first things that came to Marcus's mind was an RV that he'd seen earlier pulling out, along with several other campers who had just settled in, and they seemed concerned. And so the real question is, why were they so intent on leaving after they found a great spot? Marcus became paranoid about this, and he just made sure that his windows and doors were locked as he tried to settle down for the night. What happened next was something Marcus could only describe as hazy and disorienting. His memories of that night were fragmented, like trying to remember pieces of a dream. The first thing he remembered was being awake in complete darkness, desperately trying to breathe. It wasn't like choking. His lungs were filling with air, but it felt like he was drowning. He remembered the overwhelming panic, the desperate need for oxygen. He had a vague memory of trying to punch out one of his van windows and then stumbling toward the side doors to get them open. After that, everything went black. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in his bed with sunlight streaming through the windows. At first, Marcus thought maybe it had just been a nightmare, but when he looked around his van, he saw clear evidence that something had happened during the night. The damage was extensive, and several of his window blinds were completely shredded. One window had deep scratch marks on the inside. Even the ceiling air vent was destroyed, and all the damage was done from inside. Marcus's knuckles were bruised and swollen, and his feet were sore, probably from kicking the cabinets in his panic. A metal pole he used for his awning was lying broken in the middle of the floor. None of it made sense. The van had been well ventilated, and his carbon monoxide detector hadn't gone off. There were no signs of forced entry. Well, a few months earlier, in March, Marcus had been camping with his friends Kurt and Melissa in almost the exact same area. They'd gotten a tip from a local gas station about some pretty good dispersed camping spots up on the mountain. It had already been dark when they were looking for a spot. Not ideal, but they were tired and just wanted to set up camp. After passing several muddy, uneven spots, they finally settled on what seemed like the least terrible option. Marcus helped Kurt and Melissa set up their tent while telling them about his newly converted van. He was excited to test it out. He'd only had it for a few weeks at that point. The spot they chose was strange. Kurt and Melissa started calling it the ominous slant. That night, strange things would happen. Melissa told Marcus the next morning that she'd heard what sounded like someone wearing a squeaking latex suit walking around their tent. She called whatever it was, the happy Gimper. But for Kurt, he swore he heard a bear. Now, at some point in the night, both Melissa and Kurt heard Marcus screaming from inside his van. Not just yelling, but the kind of scream that made them think someone was being murdered. Kurt had stumbled out of his tent and rushed over to Marcus's van, throwing open the doors, but when he got there, Marcus was just sleeping. So Kurt woke him up and asked him what was wrong, but Marcus had no idea what he was talking about. He had no memory of screaming or having any nightmares. The screaming and now this latest episode had both occurred near Mount Rainier. This story feels like something straight out of the Twilight Zone, but interestingly, several park rangers who work around Mount Rainier just refer to it as the mountain, like it's the only one that matters. And of course, this isn't even going into half of the legends and lore surrounding the mountain and just the plethora of stories and UFOs and other strange things that go on. I think there's a reason Marcus initially sensed something was off that day when he camped by himself, but unfortunately, we'll never know what happened. I ask you, the viewer, was this something he did by himself, or is there something strange going on? I would love to know your thoughts. Marcus refuses to camp anywhere near Mount Rainier again. So now, you're probably thinking, okay, I won't hike or camp, I won't stay at home, I'll just get an RV or a van and find somewhere to hang out. Folks, we're in the actual X-Files here, right? And as this next segment is going to prove, things are very, very strange. On the night of September 8th, 1987, a 24-year-old security guard named David Goldthrope pulled his Land Rover into the parking lot of a construction site near Stocksbridge, England. David was this big guy, a rugby player and a weightlifter, and he wasn't the type to get spooked. In fact, when he'd taken this security job watching over the new bypass where they were building, he thought it would be the easiest money he'd ever made. David had actually been working in this security detail for about 3 months now, and every night was pretty much the same. He'd show up, meet his partner Stephen Brooks. They'd do their rounds, checking the equipment, making sure no one was trying to steal anything from the construction site, and then they'd basically just sit in their Land Rover and talk until sunrise. David met up with Stephen in the security office, a little portable building they had set up near the entrance to the construction site, and the two of them were going over some paperwork from the previous shift when their manager stopped by, and he told them that apparently some kids had been spotted near the site earlier that day, and so they should keep an extra eye out tonight to make sure that nobody was messing around with the equipment. Around midnight, David and Stephen were doing their normal patrol in their Land Rover. They were driving along this partially built section of the bypass right near P. Royd Hill, and they were thinking about a rugby match David had played in that weekend. Stephen was giving David a hard time about missing an easy tackle when suddenly David just stopped talking mid-sentence, because about 50 yards ahead of them, right in the middle of this restricted construction area, were children, and they were standing in a circle and they appeared to be playing some sort of game. Immediately, David hit the brakes and Stephen leaned forward in his seat. They both sat there watching these kids who were wearing what looked like really old-fashioned clothing. And then they heard it. These children were singing Ring Around the Roses. Now, David and Stephen both grew up knowing this was just a nursery rhyme, but sitting there at night, watching this happen in the middle of nowhere, it felt totally ominous. And Stephen told David they needed to go check on these kids and figure out how they got onto the site. And so they put the Land Rover in drive and they slowly approached where these children were standing. But when they got within about 20 feet of them, they just vanished. And keep in mind, the entire time they were calling out, nothing. They didn't respond at all. They didn't run away or hide. They just vanished. And so both men decide to grab their flashlights, and now they're investigating the area in the mud where these kids had been standing. And when they look, the only footprints they could find were their own that they had just made getting out of the vehicle. And so Stephen started walking in wider and wider circles, sweeping his flashlight back and forth, just trying to figure out where these kids could have gone. But David just stood there, staring at that spot where the children had been, and kept thinking about how when they got close enough, he could have sworn he saw right through them, like they weren't solid. Now, the two men spent almost an hour searching. They checked every possible hiding spot, every ditch, every piece of equipment, every nook and cranny, but they found nothing. No children, no footprints, and no sign that anyone had been there at all. And so as they're about to head back to their vehicle, and Stephen grabbed David's arm and then pointed up at the half-built bridge above them, and standing on the edge of the bridge was what appeared to be a monk in a black hooded robe. Now, David immediately aimed his flashlight at this mysterious figure, but the beam kind of just went right through it, and they could see the other side of the bridge. And for a few seconds, neither of them moved. They just kind of stood there with their flashlights pointed at this mysterious, transparent figure. And then the monk turned its head and looked directly at them. Now, David would later say that under that hood, where a face should have been, there was just black, nothing. And that's when both of them lost it. They sprinted back to the Land Rover, jumped inside, and David floored it out of there. They didn't stop until they reached the main road, where David pulled over because he was shaking so badly he couldn't drive anymore. And for the next few hours, they just sat there on the side of the road, neither one of them saying a word. Now remember, these were kind of rougher, tougher, bigger dudes, so to be frightened this badly definitely speaks volumes about the authenticity about what they saw. Well, at 4:30 in the morning, their manager found them still sitting in that spot, and he said later that when he walked up to that vehicle, they were both white as sheets, trembling, and Stephen was actually crying. Now, their manager had known these guys for months and realized something happened to these guys because this is very out of character. And in his words, these were just very down-to-earth South Yorkshire lads. Now, the following morning, both men showed up at the local police station. They weren't really sure why they were there because more than likely no one was going to believe them, but they had to tell someone in authority what had happened. When they tried explaining what they'd seen, the officer just kind of looked at them like they were crazy and suggested maybe they should go talk to someone else. Well, they actually went to the nearest church and spoke to the vicar, but after listening to their story for about 20 minutes, the vicar, who was basically more like a senior priest in that church, ended up calling the police to have them removed because they just wouldn't stop talking about it. Now, that was really the last day that either men ever worked on that bypass, and unfortunately, they both quit right then and there, and within a month, they'd both left the security industry completely. However, word about what both men had seen that night spread pretty quickly through Stocksbridge, and soon, even the local police decided that this is getting serious and they needed to investigate. If for no other reason than to prove there was nothing supernatural going on at the bypass. Well, later on that month, PC Dick Ellis and Special Constable John Beat were assigned to do a nighttime patrol. These guys were very experienced men who had pretty much seen everything there was to see in South Yorkshire. The two of them parked right at P. Royd Bridge, which is the exact spot where David and Stephen had seen this monk figure. Interestingly, PC Ellis would later say that the moment they pulled up, the temperature inside their car dropped so dramatically that they could see their breath. Immediately, just like that, both officers saw it. Standing right next to their car was a figure in a hooded black robe. PC Ellis immediately reached for his door handle, but before he could open it, the figure vanished. They get out to investigate, but the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. And so they were about to get back in their car when suddenly they heard this loud banging sound like someone was hitting the outside of their car with something heavy. And at this point, both men are now terrified because the entire car is shaking. But when they shined their flashlights around, there was nobody there. And when they checked the car afterward, there wasn't even a single mark on it or a dent. And so, wanting to get out of there, PC Ellis tried to start the car, but of course, it wouldn't turn over. And for almost an entire 10 minutes, they sat there trying to get it started while this banging sound just kept happening all around them. And as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet and the car started right up. Following day, when word got out that these two officers had experienced something beyond the grave at the bypass, reporters started showing up at the police station, and you can imagine how crazy that got. But South Yorkshire police wouldn't comment. In fact, to this day, they've never officially acknowledged what happened that night. But that wasn't the end of it. After the bypass officially opened, people kept having weird experiences. There were two runners out early one morning and they saw what looked like a man walking below road level, like he was walking on the old ground underneath the bypass. Now these runners, when they got closer, they were hit with this really strong smell like dust and rot, kind of like being in an antique shop. And then there was another couple driving home late one night who saw what they described as a faceless man hovering above the road. They said the figure actually disappeared into their car, and suddenly the inside of their vehicle filled with this ice-cold air. There's a local psychic named Lucinda June who went out to this spot to investigate and described that the moment she drove onto the bypass, her car became frigid and could smell what kind of was like old musty books. And she could even sense that there was a really dark presence there, and that it was the spirit of a monk who had died there over 500 years ago. Now, in my opinion, probably one of the creepiest parts about all of this was when local historians really began digging into the area's past. It turns out that 500 years before the bypass was ever built, there had actually been this monastery nearby. And during the time of the Black Death, the monks there had been responsible for burying all these children who had died from the plague. And that nursery rhyme, the security guards had heard those children singing, Ring Around the Roses. Well, a lot of people believe that song actually originated during the plague years. The Ring of Roses was supposed to be about the red circular rash that plague victims would get, and, All Fall Down part was about them dying. Now, in 1994, a TV show called Strange But True decided to do an episode about what was happening on the bypass. Michael Aspel, who's the host, managed to track down P.C. Ellis and get him to talk about what he'd seen that night. And watching this tough, experienced officer trying to explain what happened to him and John Beat, you could see his hands shaking just talking about it. During filming, the crew interviewed some of the construction workers who had helped build the bypass. Interestingly, a lot of them just kept talking about how none of them would work alone out there, especially after dark. There was one worker in particular, though, who told the crew about how he had been operating an excavator late one afternoon when suddenly his cap got so cold he could see his breath, even though it was like in the middle of summer. Something else I found very fascinating is that a local historian who had access to all these old church records had found something nobody else noticed. Back when the monastery was active, there had been this one particular monk who was known for protecting children. And according to the records, he would walk for miles every night, checking on all the local families, making sure their children were safe. And then during the plague years, when all these children started dying, this monk apparently just lost his mind with grief. Records allegedly show that he would spend his nights walking in circles around the monastery, singing to himself. And one day, they just found him dead on this hill, the exact same hill where they eventually built P. Royd Bridge. Now, unfortunately, the TV crew attempted to interview David and Stephen, but, just didn't work out. They simply refused to appear on camera. Now, the producers of the show were very persistent about getting an interview with these men. And interestingly, David, the one who was interviewed, claimed that what they saw that night wasn't just a ghost, that it was something so terrifying and impactful, it completely changed how both men saw the world. Now today, that bypass is still there, and people still report strange things happening, especially at night. And it is also known as one of the most haunted roads in all of England. The South Yorkshire police still won't officially comment on what happened to P.C. Ellis and John Beat, and perhaps whatever's out there on that bypass, it's still watching and protecting those children after all these years. But folks, the story is far from over. Fast forward to 2012, and a reporter from the Sheffield Star newspaper managed to track down Stephen Brooks. He was living in a small town about 50 miles away from Stocksbridge. He never moved back to the area. Apparently, he was working as a carpenter, and at first, he didn't want to talk about what had happened, but after a while, he agreed to share one detail he had never talked about before. And Stephen said that in the weeks after that night on the bypass, he began having these really strange dreams. In these dreams, he would be back on that construction site, but instead of being a security guard, he was dressed like one of the monks. And in every dream, he would be kind of walking through this massive field full of small crosses stuck in the ground. And he could hear children singing somewhere in the distance. And every time he tried to find them, he would just wake up in a cold sweat. And these dreams got so bad that he couldn't sleep anymore. And so he started taking sleeping pills, and even that didn't help. And he would just lay in bed at night, absolutely terrified to close his eyes. And every time he did, he just kept hearing that nursery rhyme playing over and over. Interestingly, he He also shared how just a few days after his initial experience, he had been home alone trying to write up his resignation letter for the security company when suddenly his entire house filled with this musty, rotting odor, and he heard what sounded like children laughing somewhere in his house. At that point, he searched every room but couldn't find where the sound was coming from, and then when he went into his bathroom to splash some water on his face, he looked in the mirror and saw something moving out of the corner. Standing behind him was the reflection of a hooded figure, the same one they'd seen on the bridge. Although this time, he could see its face, and he just began to physically shut down out of raw emotion and fear, and he wouldn't continue the interview further. He just flat out refused to describe what the face looked like. Basically said that after that moment, he understood why some people literally go insane from fear. Well, the reporter tried to do a follow-up interview and just kept pressing him for it. A few weeks later, found out that he'd suddenly quit his job and moved away without telling anyone where he was going. Apparently, Stephen had been acting really strange in the days before he left. Now, fast forward again in 2019, when they needed to do some repair work on the guardrails on P. Roy Bridge, the crew would only work during daylight hours. Their foreman would tell local officials that his men had been hearing children's voices coming from the empty fields around the bridge, in addition to having these strange feelings of being watched from time to time. But the most recent incident happened last year in 2023. A woman was driving home late one night when her car broke down right on the bypass, and while she was waiting for a tow truck, she said she kept hearing what sounded like footsteps walking around her car. Suddenly, all the electronics went crazy. The radio started switching stations, the lights were flashing on and off, and when the tow truck finally arrived, he found her sitting in her car completely terrified with all the windows covered in what looked like frost, even though, again, it was in the middle of summer. Now, there is speculation that the bypass was actually built right through an ancient burial ground. Others think the monk's spirit is still trying to protect those kids after all these years, but the truth is nobody really knows what's out there on that road. And because you guys made it to the end, I want you to all comment below, "Oh my." So that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural in a cinematic storytelling fashion, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.